many people here are actually not from Centerville? Can I just, wow. Okay, well then I will introduce myself. I'm Jane Guest. I've lived here for 42 years and been a very active participant in community life here in the village, including serving as the previous, or the former mayor before I retired in 2017 and passed the torch on to the lovely Julie Brisbois. So I'm supposed to do a few housekeeping announcements first. This is my new job, apparently, Mistress of Ceremonies. And so I'm supposed to tell you, first of all, the emergency exits are here and here, as well as the bathrooms. To please remember to put off your cell phones. Also that we will be filmed this evening for the archives and available online on your YouTube channel, courtesy of Joe, who's been filming all of our lecture series. Ceci, c'est le second des discours qu'on aura cette année pour fêter la 125e anniversaire de Senneville en tant que village. Alors, je veux remercier la mairesse Julie Brisbois, ainsi que le conseil, ainsi que Geneviève Fournier, et puis les bénévoles du comité de l'organisation. We have numerous events on our schedule for the 125th anniversary, and the next big event is our St. Patrick's dinner celebration. So there are tickets available tonight for $45 that you can buy from Deanne No, who's standing at the back. And there's flyers that will be available at the table that will remind you as well. So that's happening on March 14th, Saturday from 6 to 11 or 6 to 10. So hope you can join us. The first dinner evening we had was the Burns Night celebration, and it was a great success. So we hope you will join us for this one. The next speaker is scheduled for March 17th. The speaking series, c'est toujours ici, dans la même salle, toujours à 7 heures, mardi soir. Le prochain, ça va être Jim Hamilton. Et puis, ce conférencier va nous parler de Sir John Abbott, notre premier ministre, en fait, le troisième du Canada, et qui habitait à Boisbriand, ici à Senneville. Also, just to tell you that the lectures are always about 1 hour, and we encourage you to stop after or linger on and have coffee and tea and cookies with us in the back. Have a chance to speak to the speakers. There will be 2 this evening. And also we're selling 3 books tonight. So there's Je me souviens, which is really a charming collected memoirs of Senneville residents who remembered the day-to-day life of Senneville in the 1800s and early 1900s. So it's a new edition of this book that came out originally. When did it come out originally? 20, right, okay. And now it has more pictures added, and it's bigger font, easier to read, and it's really charming, a must-have for everybody. So that's $16. And then this is the book, Golfing in the Garden, Gordon Erskine, who is with us tonight, and he was our first speaker in the lecture series. And he wrote this book about the history of Braeside, so it's $30. So it's for sale tonight. And Belle de Mur Historique, and there are only, I think, 3 copies left. This is $60, so a beautiful coffee table book that everybody should have in their living room. So you can buy it tonight. And what else do I have to tell you? I think that's it, and now I can get on to the fun part of this evening, which is introducing Liz. So Elizabeth Morgan. Elizabeth Morgan is one of the 5th generation of Canadian-Scottish Morgans. She was born in Montreal in 1951 and lived in a house on Peel Street next to her grandparents, Frederick Cleveland and Bessie Shaw Morgan. Her parents, James Bartlett, or Bart, and Mireille had 1 son, Henry Jamie, who was a year and a half older than Elizabeth. Elizabeth and her brother Jamie were educated at Montreal private schools, Elizabeth at Miss Edgar's and Miss Cramp's, as well as at King's Hall, Compton, Bishops, and Jamie at Southern House. Elizabeth also attended Sir George Williams, now Concordia, and Jamie studied at McGill. When she was 18, Elizabeth's interest in photography led to a 25-year career in the film industry, where she worked in a studio of portraiture and in feature films. After that, she began a career in residential and commercial real estate. Henry Morgan et son frère James Sr., arrière-grand-père d'Elizabeth, ouvrirent leur premier magasin dans le Vieux-Montréal en 1845, 1845. Plus tard, en 1891, 1891, there's going to be a quiz on these dates after, by the way, so remember them all. Le magasin Henry Morgan and Company ouvre sur la rue Sainte-Catherine avec la mère James Jr. et son cousin Colin. Bartlett Morgan was a flying officer in the RCAF. He was general manager at Morgan's department store in the 50s and 60s before it was sold to the Hudson's Bay Company. He was a director of several companies, including the Bank of Montreal, Hudson's Bay Company, Miron, Citoyen, and president of the Morgan Trust Company until 1983. The Morgan family has lived in Centerville since 1893. That year, Elizabeth's great-grandfather, James Morgan, and wife, Anna Lyman, followed the wave of successful Scots in the mid-1800s and built their summer house, Greystanes, at 260 Centerville Road, across the road from Braeside Golf, which many of us know now as the Saputo residence, on 20 acres of waterfront land, which he bought from Claude Nicolet. The estate included the iconic tower at the end of the peninsula that is mistakenly associated with Fort Centerville. And there's some beautiful pictures, by the way, on the wall of these places. There was another sister tower across the road next to Braeside Golf Course that concealed a water cistern that gravity fed the estate's gardens by the Lake of Two Mountains, but this was demolished in 2008. En 1912, le grand-père d'Elizabeth, Frederick Cleveland Morgan, a construit le Sabot sur 8 arpents au bord de l'eau à 264-266 chemin Senneville. En 1948, 1948, le père d'Elizabeth, Bartlett Morgan, achète une petite maison de ferme Skunk Hollow à 270 chemin Senneville, voisine de la Big House de son grand-père. C'est là que Elizabeth a vécu jusqu'à que la famille déménage de Le Sabot en 1963, 1963. Durant plusieurs années, Elizabeth a vécu et travaillé en Europe jusqu'au décès de son frère Jamie en 1982, 1982. Elle revint alors à Senneville pour reprendre la ferme et aider ses parents. Elizabeth and her late husband, Charles Childers, lived at Le Sabot for many years with their son, James. Le Sabot was sold in 2017. The family has always lived and farmed in Senneville, and since the sale of Le Sabot, Elizabeth has maintained an apartment in the gardener's quarters on the organic farmland on the other side of the road from Le Sabot. Elizabeth and her son Jamie now run the original 23-acre Morgan farm, which leads to the 600 acres of the Morgan Arboretum that was donated to McGill in 1945 by her grandfather. I'd like to add to this a personal note about Liz, since I've known her for about 42 years, all the years that I've lived here. And in that time, I'm constantly impressed by her very positive, resilient nature, considering the many ups and downs in her life. She has, to me, always been a colorful, tenacious, and benevolent person. She's a true warrior, always faithful to her environmental values, and steadfastly upholding her family's heritage traditions in Senneville. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, Jane. I've met Bruce Russell, who's I consider a great friend, and almost a resident of Le Sabot. We've known each other since 2008, and he took the challenge of finding everything he could possibly find about my grandfather, Cleveland Morgan, in Le Sabot, including going to the barns and discovering suitcases and trunks from steamers and opening them up with raccoon poop and barn fag droppings, and I mean it was remarkable, a remarkable feat that he did, and I really appreciate his perseverance in uncovering all sorts of documents and papers, research, letters, you name it, in drawers that I didn't even know existed in some of the furniture. So over the years, he was able to catalog a lot of these things, and we had been looking to, at some point, to sell the house. So it took many years of my life trying to find the right owner, and also Bruce cataloged these things and decided which things belonged in the museums, which things should be given to the galleries, and it was very fortunate that a lot of the things were given to the museum, including the catalogs, which were extensive, that were beautifully illustrated and kept in beautiful condition, to the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, because in 2014 we had a fire and it destroyed basically by the smoke and by the water a lot of anything that was paper or fabric. So anyway, including the attic, which had a museum in its own right. Anyway, I could go on. I won't. I'd like to introduce to you Bruce, his actual credentials. He was born in Vancouver in 1952. He studied at the Vancouver School of Art, now Emily Carr University, and at Concordia University in Montreal. Developed a career as an independent curator and art historian, and has written extensively on both contemporary art and art history. He has published in numerous journals, including Canadian Art Studies in Visual Communications and Parachute. He has written for the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the Belkin Gallery of the University of British Columbia, the Ottawa Art Gallery, and the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Monsieur Russell entretient des liens de longue date avec le Musée des Beaux-Arts du Canada à titre d'érudit, de conservateur et de donateur. En 1993 à 1994, le musée lui a décerné la prestigieuse bourse de recherche en résidence en histoire de l'art canadien afin de soutenir ses recherches sur la vie et l'œuvre de mécène, collectionneur et artisan Douglas Duncan de 1902 à 1968. En 1996, M. Russell a contribué au catalogue de l'exposition du musée L'ingénieuse machine humaine, 4 siècles d'art et d'autonomie. En 2013, il a été co-commissaire de l'exposition Artistes, architectes et artisans art canadien 1890 à 1918. Il est membre honoraire à vie du Musée des Beaux-Arts du Canada et reconnaissance reconnaissance de sa contribution. He recently created an Agnes Martin exhibition, The Eye Cannot Know What the Mind Has Not Seen. The first focusing on the artist's influential print corpus, shown at the Esther Foundation in Calgary and the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina in the fall-winter of 2018 to 2019. He serves on the Acquisitions Committee of the Mackenzie Art Gallery, and this year he is asked to curate and install Mackenzie's new permanent collection galleries, which present a survey of painting and sculpture in Saskatchewan from 1870 to 2000. M. Russell a collaboré avec le département d'histoire canadienne et québécoise du Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal, agissant à titre de consultant pour la collection autochtone de la côte nord-ouest. Il a effectué des recherches approfondies sur la collection autochtone de MBAM et a contribué à plusieurs publications sur ce sujet. Mr. Russell has recently retired as a seasonal instructor at the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Saskatchewan, where he taught art history to Aboriginal undergraduate students at Nortep in the northern community of La Ronge. Pendant de nombreuses années, M. Russell a effectué des recherches approfondies sur le Sabot, la maison de la famille Morgan, située à Senneville au Québec. À titre historien de l'art, il a minutieusement fouillé la maison des granges et le jardin de Frederick Cleveland Morgan afin d'y découvrir un trésor d'informations. Ses recherches ont donné lieu à plusieurs articles et grâce à ses efforts, de précieux renseignements ont permis de dévoiler un grand jour des œuvres d'art et des lettres, enrichissant ainsi la collection du Musée des Beaux-Arts et la Galerie nationale d'Ottawa. I'd like to present to you Bruce Russell.
Well, it's always embarrassing hearing your life in that form pass before your ears and eyes. I guess I need to do this. There. Is that all right?
Is there, Gordon, is there a little higher?
A little bit up.
There. Is that better? Okay. So, as usual in these days, we have complicated tech. Let's hope this is going to work. There should be steadily advancing slides in this PowerPoint. And first of all, I have to apologize to Frederick Cleveland Morgan for forgetting the K in his first name. We usually call him Cleve or FCM or something. I don't actually write Frederick Cleveland Morgan out very often, and I forgot the K. But anyway, you will have heard some of what I'm going to say from the former mayor. And many of the images that I will be showing are also in the wonderful display that Liz has put up on the walls here. So if you want to look at those things or ask her about those images, we can do that after. I won't be commenting on the images. They relate to what I'm saying, and they will just hopefully move forward at a regular clip. One other thing, though, is that one of the things that we did to try to, knowing that the family would be leaving Le Sabot at some indefinite point at that juncture, we sought to document the house and grounds in various ways. Brian Merritt did a wonderful corpus of photos, some of which were selected in a book, which some of you may have seen. And there were also several films made. And in one of those, I take the viewer, the camera, on a kind of tour of the house. And we had hoped to have that edited for tonight, but in fact, I won't have time to show that. So the plan is to put it up on YouTube in the next little while, so probably next week we'll have that available, and if you want to go on a kind of virtual tour of the house, that will be available. So what I've got for you tonight is in fact a written talk. After years of teaching, I actually prefer to speak without a text, but in this case there's so many intricate and complex things that I want to get across, so it's actually a written talk. So, as a member of the third generation of one of Montreal's prominent mercantile families, Frederick Cleveland Morgan enjoyed both the leisure and the wealth to support his commitment to cultural philanthropy. His lifelong support of Montreal institutions, including McGill University, especially its rare book collections, the Morgan Arboretum, and the Canadian Handicraft Guild, is an outstanding legacy. Morgan's contribution in shaping the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts was unique. He served for many years as a board member, and eventually as its president. Perhaps his greatest legacy was his influence on the unique way in which that collection developed during the 5 decades that he was effectively its non-stipendiary curator of decorative arts and non-Western cultures. Not only was a very significant percentage of the museum's collection acquired through his efforts, but the breadth of Canada's only truly comprehensive fine arts museum was defined by this remarkable man. Le Sabot, built in 1912 for Cleveland Morgan, is one of the outstanding examples of the domestic architecture of the arts and crafts movement in Canada. Designed by Scottish-born architect David Shannon, Le Sabot was in its day one of the most innovative of the country houses built by prominent Montreal families in Senneville, on the extreme western shore of the island of Montreal. The home of the 3rd and 4th generations of Morgan's descendants until 2017, it remained furnished very much as it was in Morgan's lifetime. Remarkably informal, considering its size, it was full of light and oriented to views of the surrounding gardens. Extensive documentation of its evolution over the course of more than a century offers us a unique insight into the aesthetic vision of Cleveland Morgan, one of the most gifted of Canadian connoisseurs of his generation. In 1893, Cleveland Morgan's parents had purchased a 20-acre property at Senneville. Later on, that grew, as you heard earlier, into a much vaster assemblage of various portions of land. But in this initial 20 acres, they built a summer house that they named Greystanes. Oops, sorry, there it is. From designs by the fashionable Montreal architect Edward Maxwell. Their neighbors in Senneville included Robert Angus, Senator Louis-Joseph Fauché, whose homes were also designed by the Maxwells, and Boisbriand, the residence of Sir Edward Closton, was nearby. And his daughter and her husband, Dr. J.L. Todd, built a house also in Senneville, designed by Percy Nobbs during 1911-1912, so exactly the same time as Le Sabot was constructed. Like the Todds, Cleveland Morgan began to plan a Senneville house during that same period, turning to a compatriot of Nobbs, David Shannon, for the design. At that time, James Morgan began an ambitious project of restoring and enlarging a home in Bermuda, which he called Southlands, where he retired. Again, as you'll see, he was very, very interested in like his son, in both of these houses, reflecting local traditional building styles and techniques. Perhaps this impending move meant that Cleveland and his young family would no longer have access to the site of his own cherished childhood summer memories and the possibility of sharing those well-remembered experiences with his own young family. At the same time, assuming responsibility for Greystanes was apparently not an attractive alternative. In comparison to the summer home Cleveland would build, the Maxwell-designed home of his childhood years was out of date in terms of scale, atmosphere, and likely operating expenses. A decision was made to sell the Greystanes estate with its Maxwell shingle-style residence and to build a new home for his growing collections and his young family on a nearby property just to the north. On these extensive grounds was a well-established orchard, as well as the potential sites for alpine gardening and the cultivation of the irises and peony varieties that Morgan was interested in as a horticulturist. Cleveland approached a young Scottish immigrant architect, David Shannon, an employee of the well-known Montreal firm of Sachs and Archibald, to design the new residence. Shannon, like Morgan, was a member of the Montreal organizations that brought together those interested in the visual arts, the Artists Association itself, later become the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, the Arts Club, and the Canadian Handicraft Guild. And they likely had common friends in the architectural community, such as Nobbs and Traquair, who we'll talk about later, who shared Shannon's Scottish origin and training. Nonetheless, the nature of their relationship is unclear. No correspondence between David Shannon and Cleveland Morgan has been found, nor are the architect's plans or any business records relating to the commission and construction of Le Sabot extant in his own hand. Several small pencil sketches of modifications of the house's design survive on the backs of 3 envelopes dated 1911, but these seem to be in Morgan's hand rather than Shannon's. There. The only period drawing for the project known to survive is a sheet of tracing paper with designs for the entrance gate and a blueprint that relates to it. Several additional drawings have been found for later modifications of the house and estate. And these seem to have been produced by designers associated with Morgan's department store, which had a fully equipped design department as well. So the actual relationship and what exactly Shannon did and those kinds of details are still rather a mystery. Shannon was born in Scotland in 1880. This is a drawing by him. The Arts Club produced a rather elaborate menus for special dinners, and this is one that Shannon drew in the 1920s. Shannon moved to Montreal in 1906, where he worked for Charles Sachs and John Archibald as an assistant, and was soon promoted to serve as their chief assistant. Shannon's subsequent career focused primarily on hotel design. He was the designer of the Manoir Richelieu, the Hotel Tadoussac, and the Thousand Islands Club, all built for the Canadian steamship lines. He also worked on the design of the Hotel Besborough in Saskatoon and the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. Shannon is always credited as the architect of Le Sabot, and presumably undertook the project independently of his employers Sachs and Archibald. Although by that time well established as designers of elite urban homes in Montreal's Square Mile and in Westmount, Sachs and Archibald are not known to have received any commissions for Centerville residences. In 1912, very few villas were still being built in Centerville. Most of the main houses along Centerville Road are from that earlier generation, and many of them are by Maxwell's. The only close contemporaries of Le Sabot were the John Lancelot Todd House in 1911-1913, that I mentioned earlier, designed by Percy Nobbs and his partner Hyde, and the Boyer residence, built in 1908, which is a late project of the Maxwells, for Guy and Blanche Boyer on the estate of her father, Senator Forget, adjoining the Morgan estate. Like La Sabot, the Boyer residence was also intended to be a contemporary adaptation of Quebecois manor house. But despite its coining, that's the treatment of the corners, its dormer windows, and end walls rising above its roof line, it looks rather more Maxwell than Quebecois. It is, however, a particular relevance for its anticipation of La Sabot, both in scale and as an attempt, however tentative, to revive traditional Quebecois vernacular domestic architecture. Another contemporary home which provides an interesting context for considering La Sabot was presumably designed in the Saxon Archibald office at the same time as Chenet was working on Le Sabot. Charles J. Sachs was commissioned independently to design a summer residence for Kate and Hayter Reed. It was called Pansy Patch, and it was built in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and completed in 1913. So again, it's absolutely contemporary with the design process of Le Sabot. Although this home was built in a more characteristic and at that time already somewhat dated arts and crafts vocabulary, derivative of the English architect Voysey and his contemporaries' work from the 1890s, it conspicuously shares several distinctive characteristics with Le Sabot, notably a pronounced steep rear roof pierced by dormers on 2 levels, which sweeps down to a glazed gallery raised slightly above grade, and a circular tower punctuating its front elevation. Like Le Sabot, its design was said to derive from Jacques Cartier's Saint-Malo house, although it more distinctively quotes the Cartier residence with its single tower, Le Sabot, of course, having a pair of towers. Perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of Le Sabot is its relatively early use and its accuracy in employing the conventions of Quebec vernacular rural architecture. Although beginning in the 1920s, largely through the influence of Ramsay Tricaire, a trend to build in this tradition became relatively widespread. Le Sabot is the earliest Quebec vernacular revival residence in a strict sense, listed in the CUM inventory of homes on the island of Montreal. The only other major Quebec vernacular revival project which predates the Morgan residence was the Laurentide Club, designed by Wilfrid Arthur Gagnon, brother of the painter Clarence Gagnon, who had a Morgan connection we'll return to later, in association with the firm Finlay and Spence for the Laurentide Paper Company at Shawinigan in 1911, so just ahead. As a recreational center for its employees. Interest in a revival of Quebec vernacular architecture was increasingly current in those years. An article advocating such a revival was published in the influential but short-lived Montreal cultural journal called Le Nigogue in 1908, and a steadily growing literature on New France and its tradition was already being published in those years. It's a book by Frank Oliver Call, it was kind of a motoring in Quebec, published for an American audience. Call was a professor at Bishop's University, an important poet. And you'll see this cover actually has a house, which in many ways is very, very reminiscent of Le Sabot. If Le Sabot is indeed a pioneering instance of this Quebec vernacular architectural revival, it is necessary to distinguish which element it derives from this tradition, and what comes from other sources. The most distinctive element of its elevation, the 2 bay windows that seem to derive from the French chateau, are in fact of a much more complex derivation. Family tradition, as suggested elsewhere, would have it that the design derives from Cartier's Saint-Malo house, like Sachs's Pansy Patch. And the late 19th century renovations of the Chateau Renazé in Old Montreal. The problem with this assertion is that unlike these buildings, Le Sabot has 2 symmetrically placed towers. Although they're capped with French-style conical roofs, they in fact function in the interior of the building as bow windows, in both the salon and dining room on the first floor and in the 2 principal bedrooms on the second. If we consider the building's plan, it is immediately apparent that it closely follows that of countless English Georgian houses whose fronts present the same symmetrically arrayed bow windows flanking a central portal. If Georgian revival architecture seems rather distant from the arts and crafts taste that Le Sabot seems to embody, there are in fact several parallels. building several country homes designed by the famous arts and crafts designer C.F. Voisey feature symmetrical elevations with bow windows, such as this one, Broadleys, built in England in Lake Windermere in 1898. And these were, the Voisey buildings would have been very, very widely published and known to both the Morgan family, to Shannon, and to Shannon's teachers and the architects in Scotland that formed his taste. There can be little doubt that Cleveland Morgan, despite his age, he was 31 when the house was completed, was an unusual client, and much of the distinctive quality of Les Sabots derives from his instructions to the architect. Although Shannon had been in Montreal for 6 years at that point, he would not have had the lifelong exposure to local building, to local traditional culture that the Morgan family shared. James Morgan had fostered a strong interest in regional history and antiquarianism in his sons. Cleveland and his brothers Harold and Douglas had grown up exploring the ruins of Jacques Lebert's famous Fort Senneville, and their evergreen collection, the Nursery of Cleveland's Museological Passions, contained fragments of Iroquois pottery and implements excavated by the boys at Oka. Cleveland Morgan would later be a pioneer collector of Quebec traditional furniture and crafts. And of course, Senneville Road is fronted not only by the grand shingle-style homes of Montreal's elite, but also boasts an attractive series of traditional Quebec farmhouses that he would have known from walks as a boy all his life, especially well preserved along the to the north along Senneville Road. These were apparently a memorable part of Cleveland's childhood memories. Cleveland Morgan's years of study and travel in England, at school, and at Cambridge University coincide with the peak of the arts and crafts movement, and its influences would be of lifelong consequence for him. As well, his parents were active supporters of the Canadian Handicrafts Guild. Sorry, this is a very poor quality image. It's the best I could find online today. But it shows us the exhibition space at Morgan's Colonial House, where an early exhibition of the Canadian Handicrafts Guild was hosted by the Morgan store. Morgan regularly purchased advertising, the store regularly purchased advertising in the Guild's exhibition catalogs, and the Morgan family members routinely attended these events. Letters exchanged between Cleveland and his mother document his collecting of arts and crafts pottery and exchanging news of the Guild's exhibitions when Morgan was away for studies in England. An intrinsic aspect of the arts and crafts ideology was that architects, designers, and artisans should, wherever possible, to turn to local vernacular traditions for inspiration. Much like the local food movement today, you were supposed to study traditional building, where you were executing a building, use the local materials, and where possible, to use local craftsmen and artisans to build the house. James Morgan, there's another one of the local houses. James Morgan, James II, was an active supporter of the Montreal Antiquarian and Numismatic Society, which had been founded in 1862. The society supported a regional historical museum located in the Chateau Ramsay. Built as the residence of the governor of Montreal, the chateau is one of the most significant buildings to have survived from the French regime. It was extensively renovated by the Society between 1893 and 1895, at which time various additions built during the Georgian era were removed from the building in an effort to restore its original appearance. At the same time, a circular tower with a conical roof was added to its front. There's no evidence that there had ever been anything like that on the building. It's a complete fabrication. The intent was to link the Montreal building to the recently restored Saint-Malo home of Jacques Cartier, which we looked at earlier. James Morgan donated objects to the Society's museum, including a portrait of Benjamin Franklin, the military governor of Montreal during its American Revolutionary era occupation. And during the renovations, a Georgian staircase that was removed from the chateau and acquired by the Morgans and put in storage for more than 2 decades, and later it was incorporated into the Sabot. So it comes out of a real French era building because it wasn't authentic, and it gets incorporated into a kind of ersatz Quebec revival building 2 decades later. Morgan was not the only arts and crafts partisan to be attracted to the traditions of New France. Several Scottish immigrant architects would share this appreciation, notably Ramsay Traquair, who we see here, son of the prominent Edinburgh painter and designer Phoebe Traquair, one of the great figures of arts and crafts movement in Scotland, who would come to Montreal to teach at McGill just as Le Sabot was being finished. Traquair would initiate a comprehensive program of recording Quebec's architectural heritage in measured drawings and in a series of publications, which he had got by nefarious means out of his students. They were assigned to go all over the St. Lawrence Valley and draw very, very careful, measured architectural drawings of traditional Quebec buildings, which Traquair later published. Traquair would become a lifelong friend of Morgan's and was a frequent guest at Le Sabot. He was commissioned by Morgan to make a pair of colored woodcuts of Le Sabot and its gardens, which Morgan gave to friends as Christmas presents in the early 20s. These are beautiful prints. I think there's one example here on the wall you should take a look at later. This is the one of the gardens that was done a year later. Traquair was a pioneer in the study of Quebec silversmiths, another interest he shared with Morgan, and he bequeathed his important collection to the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Another McGill architecture professor, Percy Nobbs, was also deeply committed to the study of local vernacular, although it found only limited expression in his own buildings. This is Nobbs' own house, which is extant and now beautifully restored on the summit in Westmount. And Nobbs' own country residence was an authentic French colonial era farmhouse in nearby Hudson, which is now a museum there. David Shannon, although less directly involved in these vernacular antiquarian concerns, would certainly have understood Morgan's preoccupation with them. Like Traquair and Nobbs, and to a certain extent his employer, Archibald, all had been formed directly or indirectly by the Scottish architectural profession's deep involvement with vernacular architectural expression. You can see all over the McGill campus these buildings by these architects that look like they're out of 18th century Edinburgh. The Neurological Institute, the corner of it there, perfect example. Percy Nobbs had been Lorimer's student, and Ramsay Traquair had worked in his office. So this was a decisive pedagogical formation of these Montreal architects who had in turn trained another several generation of architects who practiced here. As early as 1899, Stuart H. Clapper, head of the McGill Architecture Department and president of the Provincial Architectural Association, had called for the publication of an illustrated study of the colonial buildings in Quebec, which of course Traquair would do a decade later, as you saw the cover of the book. But perhaps it was the painters of the generation born in Quebec in the 1860s who drew attention to the elegance and charm of traditional Quebec rural architecture most passionately. Beginning in the 1880s, Montreal painters such as Brimner, Gagnon, Maurice, and Cesar-Coté all painted rural villages and farmhouses, both in the St. Lawrence, this part of the St. Lawrence, but especially in Charlevoix. This is, I believe this is in Charlevoix. This is by Gagnon. Gagnon enjoyed a close patronage relationship with James Morgan. And in fact, James Morgan put him on a kind of stipend for a number of years when he was still finding himself as a young man, and agreed to buy his entire production, which he would then try to sell in the department store. Not exactly a thriving business opportunity for Morgan, but a life-changing experience for Gagnon. And Cleveland would have grown up with Gagnon's work hanging in both Greystanes and the family home on Sherbrooke Street. So this would be in addition to the buildings he was seeing here, he was seeing them turned into works of art by painters that were respected by his parents. Although the furnishings of Le Sabot reflect a lifetime of collecting, early photographs indicate that the character of the house was established already at the time of its completion. Many objects which appear in photographs taken soon after its completion were still in situ in 2017. In 1914, Le Sabot was listed among the best new homes of the previous year in the magazine Country Life in America. And an illustrated article on the house was published in the March issue of the following year. The description of the house seems worth quoting in full. We don't know who wrote it. My guess is that it's actually Percy Knowles, because Knowles would later write other magazine articles about Le Sabot and its gardens that have the same sound. And you'll see from the lengthy description, which I'm going to read to you, because it's so much more eloquent than any description I could have made, that it's written by someone who has a really passionate involvement with these ideas. History, climate, this I'm quoting, history, climate, and materials all leave their impress on design, and a house out of sympathy with its surroundings starts at a disadvantage. In the province of Quebec, all these forces have resulted in a type of architecture of particular charm. The early French settlers brought with them from Normandy their ideas of solidity and simplicity. In the 18th century, with the fall of Quebec, England and the colonies began to exert a defined influence, and Georgian doorways, stairways, and other details of the period appear in the houses of that time. It was this idea of trying to retrieve an interest in old French-Canadian architecture that Mr. Morgan decided to build on these lines. The country around Montreal is thickly strewn with boulders of many kinds of rock, and these were split given a variety of coloring impossible to rival. The cut stone used is Montreal limestone for window and door trims, steps, chimney caps, and corbels. The roof is of shingle blended in tones of mossy green, black, and silver gray. The construction is particularly fireproof, with concrete floors and hollow brick partitions, while asbestos sheeting has been used beneath the shingles. We saw the effectiveness of this very advanced construction at the time of the fire a few years ago. The orchard in which the house is built has been retained as a feature of the grounds and makes an ideal setting for a house of this character. Formality in the garden has been confined to one corner, surrounded by a hedge and a high stone wall. Turning to the interior, the floors in the living room are all in a tile of varying shades of red, with deep-set joints in black. The hall and library walls are of silver gray tone, forming an excellent background for old oak furnishings. The tiles over the mantle, you can see here, suggest the stoves of the continent and are of rich yellow and black. They are in old Moustier designs and were made in Paris for the house. For many years we thought these were actually vintage tiles, but they were facsimiles that were made at the time of the construction of the house. Tiles have also been used with good effect in the library. They extend around the rooms as a chair rail and spread over the windowsills and into the fireplace. The mantel is of stone, supported by crude male and female figures, which they're hard to make out there. They're there, but they're hard to see. While a touch of color is given by letting into the mantel breast an early Spanish armorial tile in blue and gold. The chintzes are in similar tones, with a blue painted Dutch table in the center of the room carries out the general scheme. The room is entered from the hall by 2 steps in the thickness of the doorway. The walls of the house are more than 2 feet thick. You can sort of see that in the window area there. Giving an ample depth to the French windows to open in the deep reveals. Attention should also be called to the hardware, firebacks, and irons in the various rooms. The plasterwork is exceedingly simple, but crude reliefs have been used on the hall and library ceilings. The dining room is paneled in white of an early Georgian type with molding cornice, the curtains and the rugs being in cream, old rose, and blue. Large double doors open from this and the hall onto the gallery, which extends the whole length of the house. This is screened in the summer and glazed in winter, and is the usual spot where meals are served in warm weather. The bedroom is reached by a winding colonial stair, that of which we've been speaking, beneath which is a cloakroom with a telephone, and the upper floor is treated in colonial style, and the bedrooms furnished with old mahogany 4-poster beds and walnut of the Queen Anne period. The floors are of oak boards 6 to 9 inches wide and are carpeted with braid mats and local habitant strips. The chintz curtains with their valances and the chinoise or landscape papers carry out the character of the furniture. The bathrooms are strictly modern, with tile floors, showers, baths, etc. A large attic for storage and a basement containing laundry, furnace, and wine cellar, etc. Complete the rooms. So that's the end of the description from country life. Morgan acquired Quebec traditional furniture and antiques from Montreal dealers such as Paul Beau during the years in which Le Sabot was being designed and built. Although Beau is better known as a metal worker, his first career was as an antique dealer. And beginning in 1910, Morgan purchased wrought iron and cast iron firebacks and silver sanctuary lamps from Beau, which would be incorporated into the new house. He began purchasing bois doré reliefs from Quebec churches, as well as 18th century Quebec furniture from other Montreal dealers such as Barron, also the Eagle Antique Shop, and S. Brightman, beginning in the 1920s. Another of Morgan's collecting interests was silver by Quebec masters such as Jean Amiot and Joseph Mailloux, an interest he shared with his friend Ramsay Tricaire. In 1920, Morgan purchased textiles for Le Sabot made by Madame J. Brunet, a neighboring farm woman who lived along the Centerville Road. Others were acquired from the exhibitions of the Canadian Guild of Handcrafts. Although these textiles do not seem to have survived, many early photographs of the house show them in situ. Here you can see a drawn thread bedspread and the rag rugs on the floor. In 1912, Morgan's cousin, the painter John Lyman, wrote to him from Pointe-au-Pic, where he was on vacation. Quote, If you want carpets and curtains for your Centerville manor, you ought to come here. And immediately, too, before the stock gets out. They make only in the slack times of the winter and sell out during the summer. The rag rugs here are simply marvelous. Not one, but makes our best look poor and banal. I have seen some in blue and white stripes and checks that might be good for your blue room. Here they cost 35 cents a yard made up, while in near Montreal they're 75 cents with stuff applied. Then there is endless varieties of homespun woolens and linens, table covers with borders, and doormats with dogs or birds or greetings. We have just got a beauty. If you can come down, let me know, and I will make the arrangements for you. The use of antiques, including Quebec traditional furniture, together with old French and American and English wood furniture, is typical of a trend that begins to emerge in the early 20th century. By 1912, the furniture and interiors executed by the first generation of arts and crafts architects, such as Ashby, Bailey Scott, McIntosh, and Voisey, were looking decidedly old-fashioned. And to a younger generation, they had learned the lesson. They weren't going to get involved in the taste of the moment. To a member of this emerging generation, such as Morgan, they were certainly interested in contemporary art. Morgan visited the famous Armory exhibition in New York and purchased works by artists such as Rodin, the sculptor, bought a watercolor from Alfred Stieglitz's 291 gallery in 1917. Another contemporary work was a bronze by Gaston Lachaise, which he acquired from the New York Gallery of German-born dealer, a close friend of Morgan's actually, Stephen Bourgeois, in 1918, as well as works by contemporaries who were Canadian, such as Goodrich Roberts, Robert Pilot, and from his cousin John Lyman. Throughout his life, he would buy objects and furniture for his own use by contemporary designers. These ranged from Orford glass. This is a piece that used to sit in the one of the tables in the dining room. It's now in the museum. Also, Ginori tiles done by Gio Ponti, the great Italian designer of the first third of the 20th century. And these Wedgwood ceramics by Eric Revilius, which used to be in the dining room. He also acquired much later Swan Chair, a very contemporary piece from 1958, designed by the furniture designer Arne Jacobson. So his taste was always absolutely up to date. But like many of his peers, he was attracted by the simple, solid, well-built pieces of traditional furniture, especially Renaissance and Southern European Baroque furniture. This was the same kind of furniture that was collected by his American contemporaries Gertrude Stein, Walter Arensberg, and Dr. Albert C. Barnes. All of these were collectors who created eclectic ensembles that exemplified the same breadth of taste represented by the encyclopedic museum collections that were being formed in North America at this time. Morgan in his homes, and remember this was Centerville house was his country house. There was a rather grand house on Peel Street in Montreal as well as at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. He sought to bring together the very best of human endeavor from all cultures throughout human history. There he is. The ensemble remained fresh and strangely timeless, its eclecticism evoking an atmosphere of familiarity, almost a sense of déjà vu among those who would visit for the first time, who recognize the types of so many of the objects in the home that they would have known from visits to museums or from looking at photographs. The sum was truly greater than its constituent elements, however distinguished they are. In the context of Les Sabots, these treasures were removed from a curatorial museum world context and restored to their domestic origins. In this agreeable context of spacious and luxurious harmony, they formed a kind of perfect mise en scène for this genteel and elegant connoisseur who so generously contributed to the cultural life of his community. So that's it. So happy to answer any questions, and we're right about on time, and so there's I believe there's refreshments and of course time to look at the rather wonderful images that Liz has put up around the room. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to